All right, welcome to my live. Thanks for subscribing and thank you for returning or leaving feedback. My channel actually could not continue as it does without you. Remember that the author of this reading material has left behind many gems for you to research further by doing individual research. And I hope that you are doing just that once you're finished with this episode. Thank you for viewing and returning to my channel over and over again. And if you haven't yet made the decision to subscribe yet, let me ask you, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and subscribe. If you're new to the channel, thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe after viewing this episode. And thank you all once again. Quirky ASF Hood genealogist, and I don't need any permission to study my ancestry or the history of this world. So there will not be any certification displayed on this journey. Why? Because I'm researching my own ancestry and history. I don't need the certifications. I have them, but I don't need them. Now, we are actually on chapter 2, book 2. Or did we read chapters 1 and 2 yesterday. We are currently on book 2, chapter 3, where the author has written the book titled The History of Ancient America Anterior to the Time of Columbus, proving the identity of the Aborigines with the Tyrians and Israelites, by George Jones, written between the dates of 1810 and 1879. I've already read book 1 and all those chapters. And if you have not, please take the time to view my past video, the reclassification of the North and Southeast Coast Amerindian, taped as a live stream. Now, I hope that you can follow along with me using this credible source to conceptualize the harm many of the people of the past placed upon the original land dwellers based on race and ethnicity, and they did so by utilizing the stroke of a pen. Combine that with biases, and all of that seems to turn into laws, and the laws govern the land masses and the power, and ultimately the control over the descendants of the original North and East Coast Aborigines today. Now, I will continue to use this book reading to interpret what the author wanted the King of Prussia to know of his findings, even though he clearly did so in paragraph 1, which consists of nearly 20 plus pages of its 492 pages. It is definitely a valuable read for all, especially the descendants of the Aborigines, the reclassified African American today. Let us continue our edification of this powerful linguistics of the truth of a people, by large, who have not yet figured out who they are or who they were told they are. Let's move forward. Chapter 3. Hiram the Great, 1046 through 990 BC. Building of David's palace, the friendship between Tyrus and Israel. Building of Solomon's temple by Hiram, the commerce and fleets of Tyrus, the causes of new wealth and power, policy with foreign countries, and death of Hiram, his character. 1046 BC. David had been king of Judah 10 years and monarch over all Israel 2 years when Hiram ascended the throne of Tyrus. The intimacy and friendship between David and Ababal were continued upon the death of the latter by his son and representative Hiram. For it is recorded that the Tyrian king sent to David at Jerusalem messengers of peace, architects and sculptors, and even materials to erect a cedar palace for the monarch of Israel, a royal gift as magnificent as it was original, and in our reading, we do not remember that it was ever imitated. He was indeed, quote, a lover of David, unquote. 1043 BC, and Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees from Lebanon and carpenters and masons, and they built David a house, quote unquote, in other words, palace. 2 Samuel verses 11 and 12. In the Hebrew, the word, quote, masons, unquote, is defined to be, quote, hewers of the stone of the wall, unquote. In other words, sculptors. The common workmen are identified by a term as expressive as can be desired for illustrating the rudiment of the art, viz. Stone squarers. 1 Kings verse 18, quote, and Hiram's builders did hew them, and these stone squarers, unquote. For 2 years previous to the death of the warlike David, he gathered material for building the Temple of Jerusalem, which by prophecy was to be erected by his son Solomon. In other words, the peaceable. For no sovereign whose life had been passed in the battlefield and amid scenes of warfare and carnage could erect, except in mockery, a temple to the peaceful God. During this period, David commanded that the sculptors who were, quote unquote, strangers in the land of Israel should be gathered for the purposes of commencing the sculpture for the great edifice. These quote unquote strangers were without doubt Tyrians. They had furnished cedar for the building, and they were also the skillful artists to work in all kinds of metals. This calling forth of foreign artists to build and decorate the temple is a conclusive proof that the Israelites were not practical architects or sculptors. The Tyrians had already built for David his regal palace at Jerusalem and were, therefore, naturally received with every courtesy by the Israelites, and many probable remained in the country. In illustration of the previous remarks, the following extracts are given from the first book of Chronicles, chapter 12. Quote, and David commanded to gather together the strangers that were in the land of Israel, and he set mansions to hew wrought stones to build the house of God. Unquote. In other words, the temple. From this quotation, it would appear that the stones were, quote, wrought, unquote, or put into shape by common workmen of Israel. In other words, these quote unquote stone squarers, and thus subsequently the quote strangers unquote, in other words Tyrians, were to quote hew unquote these stones, in other words sculpture them. David gathered material of all metals, and the only wood he obtained appears to have been the cedar from Lebanon, and for this he was indebted to the Tyrians. Quote, also cedar trees in abundance for the Sidonians, and they of Tyre brought much cedar wood to David. Unquote. The following is part of David's address to Solomon. It refers to the accomplished Tyrians as will be shown hereafter. Unquote. Actually, correction, quote, timber, cedar, and stone have I prepared, and thou hast correction, quote, timber, cedar, and stone have I prepared, and thou mayest add hereto. Moreover, there are workmen with thee in abundance, hewers and workers of stone and timber, and all manner of cunning, in other words, skillful men for every manner of work. Unquote. 1015 BC, Hiram of Tyrus had reigned 31 years when David died. Solomon, having been anointed king during the last year of his father's life, was already in possession of the regal power. Upon the ascension of the quote, wise unquote, sovereign of Jerusalem, the monarch of the Tyrians instantly sent ambassadors to congratulate him on the event. Quote, and Hiram, king of Tyre, sent servants, ambassadors, unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father. For Hiram was even a lover of David, unquote. 1 Kings verse 1. Solomon Solomon, appreciating the proffered friendship of Hiram and having resolved to build the temple to the one God, sent the following message to the Tyrian monarch for artists and materials to erect the edifice. Quote, as thou didst deal with David my father, and didst send him cedars to build him an house to dwell therein, even so deal with me. Behold, I build an house to the name of the Lord my God, to dedicate it to him, and to burn before him sweet incense, and for the continual shewbread, and for the burnt offerings mornings, morning and evening, on the Sabbath, and on the new moons, and on the solemn feasts of the Lord our God. This is an ordinance forever to Israel, and the house which I build is great, for great is our God above all gods. But who is able to build him an house, seeing the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain him? Who am I, then, that I should build him an house, save only to burn sacrifice before him? Send me now, therefore, a man cunning to work in gold, and in silver, and in brass, and in iron, and in purple, and in crimson, and in blue, and that can skill to grave with the cunning men that are with me in Judah and in Jerusalem, whom David my father did provide, in other words, did bring from Tyrus. Send me also cedar trees, fir trees, and algum trees out of Lebanon. And behold, my servants laborers shall be with thy servants artists, even to prepare me timber in abundance. For the house which I am about to build shall be wonderful great. And behold, I will guide, I will give to thy servants the hewers, carvers, that cut timber 20,000 measures of barley, and 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil. Unquote. Second Chronicles 2 3 through 10. In answer to these propositions for artists and material to build the first religious temple in Israel, Hiram sent his acceptance of the proposal in writing. Believing as we do that the spoken languages of the two nations, Tyrus and Israel, at this period were the same, with such slight variations as localities might produce. The answer being in writing confirms that opinion, for it is not probable that the Tyrian monarch would send his autograph letter in a language not to be read or understood by Solomon. Upon the elevation of Solomon to the throne of his father, Hiram sent an ambassador to congratulate him. Solomon replied by an ambassador, that was the ancient custom, and if to foreign nations speaking a different language, an interpreter attended the embassy. But here none appears to have attended, and so far from being necessary, Hiram sent his last response in writing. The bearer of the dispatch, without doubt, was a special envoy. A full investigation of the dispersion of languages will be given in the second volume. Quote, then Hiram, king of Tyre, answered in writing, which he sent to Solomon, unquote, as follows: because the Lord hath loved his people, he hath made thee king over them. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel that made heaven and earth, who hath given David the king a wise son, endued with prudence and understanding, that might build an house for the Lord and a house for his kingdom. And now I have sent a cunning man endued with understanding of Huram, my father's, in other words, his father's especial artist, the son of a woman of the daughter of Dan, in other words, of the tribe of Dan. And his father was a man of Tyre, skillful to work in gold and in silver, in brass, in iron, in stone, and in timber, in purple, in blue, and in fine linen, and in crimson, also to grave any manner of graving, and to find out, in other words, to invent every device which shall be put to him with thy cunning men, and with the cunning men of my lord David, thy father. Both father and son gathered those artists from the Tyrians. Now, therefore, the wheat and the barley, the oil and the wine, which my Lord hath spoken of, let him send it unto his servants, and we will cut wool out of Lebanon, as much as thou shalt carry it up to correction, and we will cut wood out of Lebanon as much as thou shalt need, and we will bring it to thee in floats, in other words, rafts, by sea to Joppa, a Tyrian seaport, and thou shalt carry it up to Jerusalem, unquote. Second Chronicles 2:11 through 16. The above artist, the Tyrian Phidias, whose genius seems to have been universal, had been named in compliment after the reigning monarch of his country, this Hiram. And the Tyrian love of the arts may be gathered from the facts that the quote, king's name sake was the artist ambassador for Hiram to the king of Israel. This special envoy might also have been selected in compliment to Solomon, for the artist's riddled mother was an Israelite of the tribe of Dan. The first book of Kings states of the tribe of Naphtali. His father was a Tyrian, and also doubtless renowned for works of art, as it was the Tyrian as well as the Egyptian custom for the son to be of the same profession or trade as the father. Thence the numerous pilots and mariners of Tyrus. The same custom prevails at this day in the ancient institutions of China, upon the principle that as a king's son shall be king, so shall every son be as the father. For what the ambassadorial artist accomplished, the reader is referred to the books of Kings and Chronicles. A higher compliment was never paid to the arts than by the appointment of an architect and sculptor to be a monarch's ambassador to a foreign king, and his representative at the building of the chief temple of a powerful potentate. And as if to give peculiar character to the Tyrian envoy's reception at Jerusalem, Solomon deputed a delegation to proceed to Tyrus for the purpose of escorting him to Israel, that the chief artist of the temple would have these honors conferred upon him, which were alike demanded by the solemnity of the occasion, the amity of the king of Tyrus, and the intellectual character of the artist envoy. Quote, and Solomon sent and fetched Hiram the artist out of Tyre. 1 Kings 7 and 13. Hiram the king not only, through his artists, built the temple of Jerusalem for Solomon, but also his quote, house, cedar place of the forest of Lebanon, unquote, and a palace for his Egyptian wife, the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. For these services, Hiram received the promised gift of Solomon, viz., 20,000 bushels of flour, quote unquote, beaten wheat, 20,000 bushels of wheat and wine, and oil, 150,000 gallons each, for an ephah, actually, ephah, quote unquote, or quote, bath of wine, unquote, is a fraction more than 7.5 gallons. In addition to the above, which may be received as for the temple only, there was also a treaty of peace and amity drawn up between the two neighboring kings, to the effect that Hiram should receive as annual payment that might have been for the two palaces erected after the temple. Quote, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 measures of wheat for food to his household, and 20 measures, quote unquote, baths of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and they two made a league together, unquote. 1 Kings verse 11 and 12. The last line of the previous quotation, viz., and Hiram and Solomon, quote unquote, made a league together, may have reference to a fact mentioned by Tatian, who followed the records of three Phoenician historians, viz., that Hiram gave his daughter, we think his sister, in marriage to King Solomon, and that it was through her influence that he was seduced to worship Astarte, the Tyrian goddess. This record by Tatian is apparently supported by scripture itself. Quote, but King Solomon loved many strange women together, besides with the daughter of Pharaoh, Egypt, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and Sidonians, unquote, Tyrians. Footnotes are at the bottom. And it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, Tyrians, quote, and likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods, unquote. 1 Kings 11. The king of Israel, having broken his nation's law by marrying out of his kingdom, as by his union with a daughter of Egypt, it would naturally appear to him, quote, correction, as by his union with a daughter of Egypt, it would naturally appear to him to be no increase of the misdemeanor by intermarrying with a Tyrian princess, and believing that this event must have been some years subsequent to the building of the temple, we have, therefore, hazarded the date at 1000 BC. The wealth expended by Solomon in the building, the temple, his palaces, and that attending his household had greatly impoverished the national treasury and led to excessive taxation. And this was the chief cause after his death of the rebellion of the 10 tribes from their brethren at Jerusalem when those taxes were to be continued. It must have been upon the exhaustion of the national treasury by Solomon that he obtained from Hiram loans of money to be paid not in kind but in cities. And this borrowing by the magnificent monarch must have continued for a score of years. The Tyrian king, however, refused to receive the proffered cities or lands as being unworthy of the donor or the receiver, and he thereupon affixed upon the gift a name which is now as unpleasant to a Briton's ear as it must have been to the king of Israel. The Tyrian monarch, to prove that he was not personally offended, and perhaps to shew his superior wealth, sent to Solomon a present of gold in value over 600,000 at that period, 992 BC. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had finished correction. The king of Tyre had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees and with gold according to all his desire. That then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee, and Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. Hebrew were not right in his eyes. And he, Hiram, said, what cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Kabul, in other words, displeasing, unto this day. And Hiram sent to the king 60 talents of gold, unquote. 1 Kings 9:10 through 14. From the expression, quote, my brother, unquote, it would seem, as we before hinted, that Solomon married the sister and not the daughter of Hiram, although it may be regarded as an expression of royalty. It is scarcely admits of a question which of the two monarchs exerted their royalty in the greatest splendor, whether it regards wealth or the arts and sciences. Jewish history historians, correction, Jewish historians have elevated Solomon truly at the expense of Hiram, for it is expressly stated in the Bible that for, quote, 20 years, unquote, Hiram supplied Solomon not only with material and artists for building his temple and palaces, but with money, quote, with gold according to all his desires, unquote. And added to this, which will be shewn in the last pages, Hiram supplied a navy for his brother for the voyages of Ophir and Tarshish. It should also be remarked that the liberality of Hiram's character and his toleration in matters of religion are without their parallels in ancient history. This was known to David and Solomon, for no other monarch but that of Tyrus is applied to for building and decorating the temple. This would not have been unnatural or unreasonable had Hiram been of the same practical religion as that of Israel, but he was essentially an heathen king and erected in his own metropolis the most gorgeous temples and golden statues to Jupiter, Apollo, and the minor gods, and their splendor may be estimated by what he erected for his friend at Jerusalem. The language of Solomon must have offended any mind less liberal than that of Hiram's, for in his message to the Tyrian he says, quote, "And the house which I build is great, for great is my God above all gods," unquote. In other words, plurities. This is a direct allusion to the worship of Hiram, who believed that Jupiter and Apollo were the gods of, quote, all gods, unquote. But so far from resenting the unintentional rebuke by Solomon, he actually bestows a blessing upon the worship of his ally through a though opposed to his own, for in his letter he writes, quote, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel," unquote, and that his actions should be in keeping with his words, be forthwith entered into a treaty to build the first temple to the ever living and the only God at Jerusalem. Had not Hiram been king of Tyrus, he was worthy to have been monarch of Israel. For the mind that could have acted as his own did, upon so august and solemn an occasion, was already prepared to reject plurality and believe in the one God. What a contrast does Hiram's character present to all the Roman monarchs from Tiberius to Maxentius when in a similar position from the introduction of Christianity. From the foregone description of the Tyrian arts and artists, and for details, the books of Kings and Chronicles will testify. It will not be questioned whether from personal knowledge and skill they could have built the cities and temples lately discovered in the Western Hemisphere. But more especially is the question now admissible from the fact that the styles of the architecture of the temples at Jerusalem and Palenque we have shown to be analogous, if not identical. Scripture does not warrant any historian in writing that the Israelites had a knowledge of navigation. It has, however, been often stated that they had, because Solomon, quote, made a navy, unquote. But the sense is that he gathered a navy, and this is proved from the fact that Hiram furnished that identical, quote, navy, unquote, for the king of Israel. Navigation was the only point in Tyrian policy in which they resolved to have no rivals, and to prevent it, they supplied expeditions for other countries, galleys, pilots, and mariners. They formed treaties for this purpose with nations with whom they were on terms of amity. Hiram followed the national policy at this time with Solomon, and the Tyrians did the same subsequently with the Egyptian. Writers in attributing to the Israelites a knowledge of navigation quote from the first books of Kings 9 26, 992 BC, quote, and King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion Geber, which is beside Elath on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. But those writers avoid quoting the succeeding verses in 2 into Second Chronicles 8, 17 and 18. Quote, and Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen, in other words, pilots and mariners. They had a knowledge of the sea with the servants, quote, common hands, unquote, of Solomon, unquote. Quote, then went Solomon to Ezion, Geber, and Elath at the seaside, Red Sea, in the land of Edom, and Hiram sent him by the lands of his servants, ships and servants that had a knowledge of the sea, unquote. In other words, pilots and mariners. Now, this last quotation has reference to the same voyage, and it is there shown that the Tyrians actually built the ships. They were probably framed and fashioned at Tyrus, then taken in parts overland. For Hiram, quote, sent them, unquote, and that is the only way the timbers could have reached the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. And then the ships were built or put together by the Tyrians at Ezion Geber, and from thence they commenced their voyage to Ophir, although some doubt the locality, on the shores of India, and their return cargo was, quote, 420 talents of gold, unquote. In other words, 2 millions and a quarter sterling. We are anxious to establish the fact that the Israelites had no knowledge of navigation, and that upon the authority of Holy Writ, for the Aborigines of North America who are descendants of Israel have no nautical knowledge in its enlarged sense, and therefore, as analogy will be proved by the absence of commercial knowledge. In concluding the reign of the most renowned of the Tyrian kings, the record of whom is placed beyond doubt or question in that volume which will endure until the world itself shall become a clouded scroll, a glance may be necessary to review the causes that led to the exalted and unrivaled character of Tyrus. For that nation, at the completion of the Judean temples and palaces 992 BC, was without a rival in station or power, and beyond those worldly points it stood unapproached save by Israel in the highest attributes of the mind, in the in the majesty of intellect, the chief ministers being science, the arts, and the long line of faithful followers, attendant of every refinement and accomplishments. The great secret of the inviolable distinction was navigation. The power led the Tyrians into foreign cities. It enabled them to give or receive from their allies in the several parts of the then known world all that was useful or novel in exchange for their own exports until Tyrus became the nucleus of all intelligence. He's speaking of the Negroes of the North and South East Coast Aborigines. Upon this treasury of gathered knowledge, she improved and increased her power by retaining what was good, rejecting what was useless. Tyrus stood in the estimation of the world like a majestic temple which all mankind had aided in building. But when erected and secure, none of the builders were allowed to enter. If a foreign nation required a naval expedition, Tyrus was the only power to furnish it in every department: material, shipwrights, pilots, and marinas. This is proved by the fleets loaned to the kings of Israel and Egypt. And the Tyrians never made a voyage for another country, that they were not the especial gainers by the expedition. All discoveries of islands were their own, for they alone could keep or reach them afterwards. For they alone could keep or reach them again afterwards, for other countries were destitute of fleets. The naval profession in the minds of the Tyrians was, apart from religion, elevated above all others. They regarded it as a peculiar gift from the gods, bestowed upon them as a national blessing. This was confirmed in their estimation because, as a necessity, it was associated with the sublime study of astronomy. Religion itself was brought to enhance its value. Thence their temple to Neptune. The highest attributes of the mind were brought forward to support the science. Thence even her philosophers were helmsmen, for in the language of the prophet Isaiah, quote, "Thy wise men of Tyrus that were in thee were thy pilots," unquote. When a foreign nation created a navy without the sanction of Tyrus, then, as before stated, the latter country made war or crusades against the vessels as they should appear upon the Mediterranean. The quote, "daughter of Sidon," unquote, attempted no inland conquest. She was content that her throne should be on the seas, and the means she took to conceal her discoveries and the secret of her shipbuilding from foreign countries were as ingenious and determined as her resolution to have no rival was indomitable. To conceal them, to conceal the then secret of shipbuilding, the Tyrians resorted to the following means of commercial intercourse with all new and even with some of the surrounding nations, ancient Iberia and Etruria. Surrounding nations. Let me read that again. To conceal the then secret of shipbuilding, the Tyrians resorted to the following means of commercial intercourse with all new and even with some of the surrounding nations, ancient Iberia and Etruria. This a Tyrian galley would approach, for instance, Britain or Hibernia. Only by night the goods were landed and left unattended upon the rocks or beach, which means that they traded a lot back then. The galley would then be rowed to such a distance that the natives in the morning could make no discovery of the manner in which it was built. The galley, however, from her high mast served as a beacon to them, and thence conveyed intelligence that a cargo had been landed. The natives would then investigate the goods and in return place by their side metals and other commodities supposed by them to be of equal value. They're not talking about native Indians, they're talking about natives of a specific land or kingdom or community. They then, from a previous treaty, would retire out of sight, whereupon a small boat would leave the galley and approach the shore. The supercargo would compare the value of the metals or goods offered in return, and if found to be of an equal barter, the galley would then be rowed to the coast, but at night only the exchanged goods would be placed on board, and having left before the dawn, the secret was secure. If the natives placed in exchange less than the value, the Tyrian boat would retire. The aborigines would again approach and increase the payment. If they could place more than the value of the cargo, the honor of the Tyrian merchant, truly singer of the sea, was such that he would not take the overplus, but leave something of value set apart as a compliment to the generous islanders. This, without doubt, was the origin of commercial barter. And if you know today, a lot of bartering has been outlawed and founded upon the refinement of honor and honesty. It may be remarked that a similar custom prevails even at the present day at Constantinople, for when a shopkeeper retires for his meals or even for a walk, he never closes his doors or his windows. Every article has its price marked or affixed to it. The passer-by wishing to purchase takes the article and puts in its place the amount in money. Fraud is not known, for the merchant leaves it to honor, and that never betrays honesty. The bard of Avon must have thought of this scene and of the impossibility of its universal application when, in reply to the announcement, quote, that the world was grown honest, unquote, he states that the day of doom must be at hand. What a millennium would we be achieved by the human race when every metropolis shall practice customs in analogy with that in the city of the Sultan, or those of the merchant princess of ancient Tyrus. The determination of the Tyrians to keep the secret of their discoveries was as desperate as their method of concealing the secret of shipbuilding was ingenious. To illustrate this point of national character, an historical anecdote will be given as being required by this work, although the incident occurred some ages later. The Romans, having become a maritime power and having intercourse with Tyrus, ascertained that that nation imported from a foreign country a white metal which the sons of Rome imagined to be silver, and that it was brought from beyond the pillars of Hercules, now the straits of Gibraltar. The metal which had aroused the curiosity and avarice of the Romans was tin, and obtained by the Tyrians from the Isles of Britain and Hibernia, but, especially from the former, and to the Tyrians is that island indebted at this day for her ancient name Britain, and of her guardian goddess Britannia, for the word is derived from the Tyrian language, Vist, Brit, Tanakh. In other words, land of ten. So that there is actually a mysterious link in the chain of history between Tyrian Britain and Tyrian America, which has existed for more than 2,000 years. But to resume, the future conquerors of Britain resolved to find out the secret as to where the pseudo silver came from, and consequently, they, unknown to the Tyrians, placed a galley on shore of the coast of Gaul within the British seas and patiently watched the approach of the vessel of their rival, known to be on a metal expedition with the islanders. The Roman allowed the Tyrian to pass on without interruption, for the two nations were at peace, and then followed at a great distance unperceived by lowering the mast and sail and depending upon the rowers. As the owner of the secrets approached Britain, thus discovering which of the isles were the object of their voyage, the Romans hoisted sail, plied their oars, and followed on their foaming track, that their chance for barter should be equal to the Tyrians. The latter, finding that they were discovered, instantly increased their speed towards the isle, thus enticing the former to follow. All were all were silent on board the Tyrian galley, as if in sorrow at discovery. The Romans gained upon them. The sons of Sidon, and in apparent despair, threw overboard their cargo and all useless material, as in fear of losing the secret. The Romans, believing that the Tyrians, by sailing close inshore, and from their loss of cargo, were about to land in sullen silence, instantly renewed their energy both by oars and sail. On sped the first Roman prow through British seas, dashing through the waves like a wild seabird, and on the silver track of ambition, amid loud huzzas and shouts of victory. They were dazzled in their own eyes from danger. On they flew like the eagle of their country, imperious and as proud, when sudden as the falling of a star, the Roman galley struck upon the wave covered rocks. The ship was rent asunder. All were lost. Not one returned to the eternal city to betray the secret. The last Roman shout of despair at the moment of the defeat was caught and echoed as one of triumph by the ingenious and resolute Tyrians, for they in the friendly chase threw over the cargo, not only to lighten their ship for sailing, but to pass over shallows, rocks, and sands where the purser, heavy laden, would be sure to strike. And therefore the danger of shipwreck was also apparent to the Tyrian himself. His vessel, quote, wise men, unquote, and mariners still to follow a national monopoly according to the policy of his country, he dared the hazard of the die, although life and wealth were in the desperate game. It is not, therefore, to be wondered at that Tyrus, from practicing such devices and courage, upon the waters of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, should have gained and secured to herself the title of Queen of the Sea. But the policy was not founded in brotherly love or neighborly intercourse, and as a consequence, the Tyrians were against every rising maritime nation, which drew from those countries in return an unconquerable contempt for their pride and monopoly, and compelled them to place so high a duty upon imports into Tyrus as by degrees to injure her prosperity, and the several nations thence, as a necessity, became their own manufacturers. The writer or the reader of history would pass his time uselessly if he did not draw strong conclusions for a nation's downfall. When built upon such an unjust foundation as that of absolute and unconditional commercial monopoly, nations of ancient days should be viewed as beacons for the modern. Although Tyrus visited every country, yet every nation at this time, Sidon and Israel excepted, received her with wounded pride. No home or haven was given from love, but from fear. Every hand was ready to be raised against her, and when the fatal moment arrived, when it could be done with safety, not a nation upon the surrounding shores of the Mediterranean, but at once exerted the wished for resentment. And this was but in accordance with prophecy. Ezekiel 26. Quote, many nations to come up against thee, unquote. In other words, Tyrus. This just behavior the Tyrians knew would be their doom, and in the day when the judgment of Godland and in the day when the judgment of God and of nations fell upon them, they acted in the great emergency in a manner perfectly in keeping with their ocean spirit of independence. We will not anticipate events pertaining to warfare, for the reign now under consideration was one of peace and happiness. Of King Hiram, we may justify right that he was the original upon whom the Athenian Parasols in after ages founded his own splendid public character. For the love of the fine arts in all their branches seems to have been Hiram's dream by night, his reality by day. He gathered around the wise and the good, the gifted and the talented, to illustrate his own conceptions, for his brain was the casket wherefore his nation's service and that of his allies were gathered those inestimable jewels of the mind that wealth can not purchase and death itself cannot destroy. For corroding time has hallowed them to the present day and will to all posterity. The temple of Jerusalem, erected to the one living God, claims not Solomon for its founder with a greater certainty that it does Hiram for its builder. In following the above course from the direction of a superior and elegant mind, Hiram but consulted the true glory of his people, for he encouraged not only poetry, music, and the scientific arts, but enlarged his commerce, enabling his kingdom thereby to pursue the accomplishments and the intellectual adornments of life. For the fine arts and commerce are as essentially the instruments of peace as swords and spears are the weapons of war. The country guarded by her feudal towers and banners may be physically secure in parts of the kingdom, but the nation that points to the walls of artistical and scientific galleries, to the temples of the muses, literature, and education, and to free swelling sails for her bulwarks and standards, is intellectually defended in every quarter of her domain, for peace is the citadel, and the several branches of prosperity, her moated outwards, correction, her moated outworks. Through the long life of Hiram, whom we have ventured to style, quote, the great, unquote, he continued the firm ally of David and Solomon, was the friend and promoter of peace, humanity, the arts and sciences, was the uncompromising enemy as a consequence to all warfare dependent upon or emanating from the bloody path of conquest. And to these high points of character may be justly added that he was, quote, the sworn and covenanted foe, unquote, to religious bigotry or intolerance. The reader will not then wonder that, during his reign, that Tyrus reached the highest point of intellectual grandeur in the estimation of antiquity, and from united acclamation, her triumphant statue was placed upon the chief pedestal in the temple of history. While Hiram lived, his mind was a pharos, where whose revolving light illumined every point to guard his fellow man from the rocks of danger and to ensure a peaceful haven, true nature's harbor. But at his death about 990 BC, the shade remained upon the Tyrian quarter and threw its shadow over the people, while other nations took advantage of the forecast gleams and found for themselves a brilliant track to power and safety. Such was the patriotic, peaceful, and intellectual King Hiram of Tyrus, whose reputation has descended with increasing splendor through a period of nearly 3,000 years. His elevated mind, extensive knowledge, religious tolerance, the patron of education, literature, arts, and science, the friend of oppressed humanity, and the patriot king, all are again revivified amid the applause of nations in the person of the present William of Prussia. And may posterity record his memory to the date of this Tyrian prototype, that his example may be imitated by future kings and rulers. That concludes our reading of Book 2, Chapter 3 of the History of Ancient America Anterior to the time of Columbus, proving the identity of the Tyrians and the Israelites. Again, on closing, please be mindful of misinformation, especially the attempt at eliminating all information and history regarding the true atrocities of people of color and their forefathers. Remember to check out my videos about the Cactocton Iron Furnace burial remains. Set your notifications so that you can tune in to the next scheduled live here at the My History Verified YouTube channel.